I'm used to talking about one or three things here, so I might go over time, but please hit me over the head if I do. So some of you might know that part of the reason that I got into the Ottoman Empire is because of my family history. I am half Greek, and if you grow up with a post-Ottoman, especially a post-Ottoman Balkan culture, you know that our particular brand of nationalism includes an element of religion, and this is because in the Ottoman Empire, the primary distinguishing factor between peoples across the empire was religion. There was a system called the millet system, which divided people by religion. So if you were Greek, you belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church. If you were Muslim, you were just Muslim. And if you were Catholic, you had different labels. If you were Armenian, you belonged to the Armenian, Gregorian Church, etc. So we tend to think of, as people from the post-Ottoman Balkans, language going with religion, going with identity, etc. But if we look at documents from the period of the Ottoman Empire at different times, we can see that this isn't always the case. The first thing that I have to show you right here was written sometime between 1580 and 1582 by a man who goes by many names, Murad The Interpreter, but his birth name was, and I'm glad that Peter isn't here to correct me, Bodleian. He was a Transylvanian, probably son of a noble family, abducted at the age of 17 after the Battle of Mihai, which the Ottomans won in Transylvania. He was taken to the system known as the Devshirme system, which took promising young boys from mostly Christian families and entered them into the service of the Ottoman government. And this was a type of forced conversion, more or less, but you can clearly see that Murad the Interpreter was very comfortable with his Muslimness because he became an avid writer of prayers, hymns, and literature aimed at converting the population of his native Transylvania to Islam. And here you can see a document, autograph of Murad the Interpreter in his own hand in 3 languages and 2 scripts with Ottoman Turkish, Latin, and Hungarian in both the Arabic and Latin scripts here. And this sort of doesn't necessarily problematize the narrative that I talked to you about before, right? Because his Muslimness is definitely articulated through a Turkish lens. But that isn't always the case. If we look at the second document here, about which we know very, very little, we can see it looks to the untrained eye like standard Ottoman Arabic script, very nice, but if I read it, you'll notice something weird. It begins Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, no surprise there. Shukri ektopmas edo kesti bisti hidayeti opomas ekame emas to Muhammed ummeti kestus prophetis nane to salavati ke selam. Anybody know what language that is?
Greek.
That's Greek, exactly, right? So we know very, very little about this manuscript, aside from the fact that its author was a man by the name of Ahmed bin el-Haji Yusuf. This indicates something important because his patronymic is not Ibn Abdullah, which is the name given to new converts. Right? His patronymic is an actual Muslim name of a Muslim man. So we know that he wasn't a convert. That means he must have been a first, second generation Muslim who was still using Greek as his primary language. We have some indication that it might have come from the area around Malatya in southern Anatolia. Malatya did not have a large population of Greek speakers, but there are some margin notes that mention the town of Darende, which is a neighborhood in modern Malatya. But it's also not true that everything in Turkish was an Islamic context. So if we look at this manuscript, again, it looks like a very nice Syriac manuscript, and indeed there is some Syriac. But right after the Syriac, we have this sentence. Bismel eb vel ibn vel ruh el kudus el illah el vahid amin. Şükrederim sana ya Rabbim ve ilahim Jesus el Mesih. So you might have caught the name Jesus el Mesih, Jesus the Messiah. But this is, in fact, in Ottoman Turkish. It was written by a man named Huroyo Antonius Nankarito Mabrachto Gusta, from the blessed city of Gusta, Antonius, or Anthony, the Chorepiskopos, which is a rank in the Maronite Catholic Church. We don't know if it was written in Gusta in modern-day Lebanon, Kasserwan, but it probably is because there's a large Maronite monastery there. And it's interesting because there are 2 colophons to this. One which is in Syriac, which the scribe was clearly comfortable with, and another one in Arabic, which the scribe was also clearly comfortable with, but in which he states, please forgive me because I wrote this manuscript without knowing Turkish. So it's very clear that there was a priestly caste that was comfortable in languages like Syriac and Arabic, but not so comfortable in Turkish, whereas part of their flock used Turkish as a primary language. And we have other copies of this with a much less skilled hand that have a bunch of notes poorly written in the Syriac script in Turkish, probably of members of the flock, right, that this scribe was targeting. But it's also not the case that Turkish was the sole purview of Muslims and Christians in the empire, because in this next document, we have something that looks like your standard Hebrew or maybe Ladino, because it's in Rashi's script. It's probably from the 1500s. There's a lot of debate as to exactly when. But if you read the first words, it is Ol ki tarihi Ali Osman'dır, which means this is the history of the dynasty of Osman. Interestingly, because of the nature of the text, Neubauer, who made the first catalog of our Hebrew manuscripts here, assumed that this manuscript, especially the parts written in the same hand, were written by a Mohammedan, as he said. And he also cited as evidence for this the fact that the Judeo-Spanish in another part of that manuscript contains a lot of grammatical errors. In fact, what this is probably representing is the fact that if this was written, especially in the early 1500s, this would have only been several decades after the arrival of the Spanish Jews from Iberia, who were given refuge by the Ottoman Sultan in 1492 during the Inquisition. So there are documents in Judeo-Spanish within the same manuscript because it was an important language of science. However, the native language of our scribe may very well have been either Turkish or Greek. At this point in time, there was a Jewish community in Istanbul left over from Byzantine times called Romaniotes. And we have evidence to suggest that many of them, with the conquest of Constantinople, switched their primary language from Greek to Turkish around the period of time when this manuscript might have been written. But Jews weren't the only population given refugee status in the Ottoman Empire. About 400 years later, we have the people known as the Circassians, who were linguistically incredibly diverse, but came from the North Caucasus, across the border from the Georgian Republic and what is now the Russian Federation. And this is a manuscript penned probably in the first 2, maybe 3 decades of the 1800s. And it represents what I call the Araboform alphabet, not the Arabic alphabet, but it's based on Arabic with lots of completely novel letter forms, of a nobleman named in his native Kabardian, which is a Northwest Caucasian language, Noghma, Shora, Bekmurza. Now, he was a very famous person who lived, I have the exact dates, but from 1794 to 1846, if I'm not mistaken. And he was experimenting with the creation of a national sort of standard for his Kabardian-speaking people in the North Caucasus. It didn't catch on, and we don't really know how this manuscript arrived into our collection. But I mention it as part of Ottoman linguistic diversity, largely because about 2 decades after the death of Noghma, Shora, Bekmurza, most of the Kabardian speakers in the world were either murdered by the Russian Empire in the Circassian genocide, which was basically the middle of the 1800s. And the vast majority of speakers of Kabardian then fled to the Ottoman Empire as refugees, where they continued to write in other versions of the Arabic alphabet, which had been traditional to them for several centuries at the time. When we think of genocides in the Ottoman Empire, obviously we don't usually think of their being the receivers of refugees, but they're being the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. And the last item that I want to show you today is this hymnal, which if you look at it as an untrained eye, again, you say, oh, that's an Armenian. But if you read it, it says, Yarkarane le Kurmanji, which is hymns in Kurmanji, Kurdish. And it says, Basma bu le Basma Khana Koleje le Kharpeti, 1880, which means it was printed in the printing house of the college in Harput, which was a town which was at least half Armenian in the years before the Armenian genocide, and the other half was largely Kurmanji, Kurdish speaking. Now, it says the printing house of the college, and there's a reason why it doesn't give the name of the college. Because at the time in which this book was printed, the name of the college was the subject of a legal battle between the Ottoman state and the American Missionary College, who had set up the school. They had originally called it the American Armenian Missionary Seminary, then the American Armenian Missionary College, both of which were sort of okay, but they got a bit brave a couple years before this book was published and decided to call it Armenia College. And that was a step too far for the Ottoman government. So at this point, they were just, in everything that they printed in local languages, calling it the college. And several years later, they were forced to change it to Euphrates College, which was a name that was not offensive to the Ottoman government. But I brought it here simply because one might think that since this was a missionary college, the aim of this book was to convert the surrounding Muslim Kurdish-speaking population. But in fact, if you look at interviews with people at the time, survivors of the genocide, who were, some of whom killed before the official beginning of the genocide, about a decade after this book was published, in what were known as the Hamidian massacres, which is the violence that was perpetrated before the sort of 1915, which we know is the date of the official Armenian genocide. But a lot of them had as their first language Kurdish. So this may very well have simply been for the local, less formally educated Kurdish-speaking Armenian population who would have been comfortable with the Armenian alphabet because of hymns and things like that, or the Bible or things, but not comfortable so much with the Armenian language. So I think I might have gone over time. But I wanted to also thank Cesar, who is our curator of Hebrew and Judaica, for bringing 2 extra manuscripts here that tie in nicely with, or printed books, sorry, that tie in nicely with the manuscript that I showed you there, because they show the linguistic diversity of the Jewish community in the Ottoman Empire really well. They're both published in the 1540s by a Jewish family that originated in Italy. But they published them as exegesis of the Torah for 2 different markets. One for the sort of Eastern market that has, of course, Hebrew and Aramaic, but also Persian and Arabic in Hebrew characters. And another produced for the sort of standard Ottoman market, which has the same, of course, Hebrew and Aramaic, but also Ladino, that is to say Judeo-Spanish, and Judeo-Greek, catering to that Romaniot community that I mentioned before. And here I have also, because I can't help myself, if you wanted to know what standard, quote-unquote, Kurmanji Kurdish would have looked like at the time, they had their own tradition of writing in the Arabic alphabet. And this is our one that I know of full Kurdish manuscript, written in Kurmanji. 17th century poet Melayê, who wrote a Divan in Kurmanji, one of the earliest known lengthy works in Kurmanji Kurdish. And the manuscript was probably penned in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. In either the mid-1800s or mid-1900s, a crucial word is scraped off in the colophon. So yeah, this is the sort of other Ottomans, the periphery of identity groups in the Ottoman Empire through their linguistic production. So I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to ask me or Cesar any questions.